Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Top 10 Best and Worst Two-Parters from Star Trek. In this video I will count down my favorite and least favorite two-part episodes from I would say the entire Star Trek franchise, but mainly just the legacy shows, the original series, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and Enterprise, as most of the more modern shows are more serialized, so it gets a bit more dicey what a two-parter is, and there are some clear two-parters, but I'm just not as familiar with those shows at the moment, so I am going to focus on the original 5 for the purposes of this video. So this video is a Patreon requested video, requested by Kyrie091. Thank you so much for your request. And so first I want to define what I am considering to be a two-parter for this particular video, because even with the original 5, particularly when it comes to Deep Space Nine and Enterprise, it gets a bit dicey on what a two-parter is. So two-parter, well, as Kyrie091 laid out in his request, a two-parter should also include 2-hour-long episodes such as like Emissary, All Good Things, like series premieres, and like The Way of the Warrior and stuff like that that was aired as a 2-hour episode. Those count as two-parters, so those will be included. But then there's the thing, and the rule my sister is doing for her top 100 that she's doing at the moment on her channel over on Alyssa Jean Reviews. She has a rule where if it's a two-parter that has the same title, like Best of Both Worlds Part 1 and 2, she considers that one episode. But if it's a two-parter with several different titles, then those are considered separate episodes. And I actually decided, because I thought about this long and hard, and I decided for this video I will actually include two-parters that do have separate titles, but they have to be clear two-parters. In other words, they can't be like three-parters or part of an overarching storyline. For example, the Deep Space Nine station takeover arc ends with 2 episodes, Favor the Bold and Sacrifice of Angels. Many people consider that a two-parter. That would not be eligible because it is part of a larger serialized story. Same goes for Enterprise Season 3 that has Azadi Prime and Damage. Some people consider that a two-parter. I actually never did. I think those are 2 separate episodes, but regardless, is part of a longer story arc. And same thing with Countdown and 0 Hour. Many people consider that the two-parter that ends out Season 3 of Enterprise, but I consider more of a three-parter because the Council sort of is the first part in that three-parter. But regardless, it's a part of a larger story arc. And so, and yes, I am not doing three-parters. That excludes the Circle trilogy, a lot of the trilogies in Season 4 of Enterprise. However, Enterprise does have some two-parters in Season 4 that have different titles, but I still will count them, and there's several Deep Space Nine two-parters that will still include that have, even though they have different titles, because they are clear parts 1 and 2. They stand alone as itself. One that was very iffy for me was the 2-part episode that starts out Season 7, something Shadows and Symbols and something else, I can't remember, but anyway, I almost included that, but really the more I thought about it, the Season 6 finale is really a part of that because it ends on a cliffhanger, and they say previously on when they showed the Season 1 finale. Even though those first 2 episodes that start out Season 7 are more self-contained than Tear of the Prophets, it's still Tear of the Prophets that makes up a trilogy, so that's not included. Anything where it's dicey, where it might be a trilogy, will not be included. It has to be a clear part 1 and 2 that stands independent and alone from the episodes that surround it, such as Improbable Calls and the Dias Cast, because the episodes that came before and after that have nothing to do with it, or Homefront and Paradise Lost in Season 4 of DS9, because the episodes that came before and after that have nothing to do with that. So those are my rules of what constitutes a two-parter. Now, so before I get into my countdown, I want to give a shout out to Kyrie091, because in his message to me to request this video, he mentioned he wanted to hear about, or that he personally likes, the two-parter Gambit. But that unfortunately did not make my top 10 best or top 5 worst. Gambit, so when I did my criteria for two-parters, I came up with 37 episodes, and Gambit came on my list at number 18. So it's pretty much right in the middle, which is pretty much what I think of that episode. It's not bad, it's not great, it's kind of middle of the road for me. So, but I did want to call that out as an episode that Kyrie091 particularly liked. So, let me get to my worst list first of all, and I think you'll notice a theme. So for my worst list, I'm actually going to do a top 5 rather than a top 10. And when I get into my best list, I'll do a top 10. So, yes, you'll notice a theme on my top 5 worst. 4 episodes fit a general theme, and 3 episodes fit a more specific theme. But anyway, we'll start with my number 5. Descent, Part 1 and 2, the two-parter that ended Season 6 and began Season 7 of Next Generation. Part 1 of this is actually decent. It's okay. It kind of meanders a bit too long and is maybe too slow-paced and maybe too much setup, and that setup is they completely dropped the ball on this on it in season and at part 2. Part 2 was absolutely terrible. It wasn't done right. This is probably an example of maybe you should know where you're going when you write a part 1. Just what I'm saying. But anyway, number 4 on my worst list actually it's the only one in my top 5 that does not fit the theme, and that is Broken Bow, the season premiere of our pilot episode of Star Trek Enterprise. I am on record of not really liking this. I think this is maybe I just have a bad taste in my mouth because it made me realize how bad Enterprise was going to be for at least for its first 2 seasons, and it's just not well, and it represents everything I don't like about the show. Alright, so next we'll get into my top 3, and this is where we get into the more specific theme, which I think you'll pick up on pretty soon. Number 3 on my list is Unimatrix 0, Parts 1 and 2. That's a two-parter that ends out Season 6 and starts Season 7 of Voyager. This deals with the Borg Queen having this, and there's this group of rebel Borg that have this magical place where they meet 7 of 9, and so Janeway goes undercover and gets assimilated by the Borg, and they risk their lives for something that is never brought up and mentioned ever again, so who really cares? And next, we'll get into my number 2, which is Dark Frontier. I believe this was aired actually as a 2-hour episode, but then on reruns shown as a 2-parter on Voyager's 5th season that retcons the shit out of Voyager in ways that anger, not just Voyager, Star Trek in general, but Voyager itself, that angers the shit out of me. It treats the audience like morons. It introduces the Borg Queen to Voyager, which I think is the worst thing to happen to Voyager. Getting back to this theme you might pick up on. It's just, there's some good elements to the episode, but this is done by, there's so many plot contrivances, so many things that are terrible, lazy retconning, that this episode to me represents like just lazy, bad writers who are too lazy to come up with anything interesting and just want to throw spectacle at your face to try to get you to overlook or not notice how terrible the writing is. So Next, we will get into my number one worst two-parter of Star Trek. And if you are at all familiar with my channel, this will surprise you not at all. It is Endgame, the series finale that ends out Voyager. I made an 1.5 hour long video about how terrible this finale is, and I've talked about this on so many top 10s. Top 10 worst, almost every top 10 worst or top 5 worst list I do this that is eligible for, it usually makes number one, but sometimes, not always, it doesn't make number one, but it's usually on there. I think this is the worst series finale of all of television. I mean, excluding shows that are bad to begin with, those don't count. But good shows, this is the worst way you could possibly end the show. There's so many reasons for this, be it, the Borg Queen, getting to that theme, who is terrible, acts like a cartoon villain, the plot that makes no sense, the character motivation of Admiral Janeway going back in time to change the past that makes no sense and violates what the show actually stands for, and the very quick and nonchalant way that they end the series, not giving fans satisfaction of actually seeing Voyager return home, other than a stupid parallel future, alternate future, which who gives a fuck about that? Therefore, making this an insult to anyone who appreciates Voyager, so it's clearly the worst two-parter. Next, we will get into my top 10 best two-parters of Star Trek. I'll start with my honorable mentions that very nearly made my list. First two honorable mentions I'll mention are both series premieres. There's Emissary from Deep Space Nine and Caretaker from Voyager. Both of these I think are great ways to start the shows. Emissary is the B plot I wasn't that big on. The A plot's amazing, but the B plot not so good. Caretaker's more consistent, where I think is a really good, strong way. It's just a good story in its own right, and also a good way to introduce the characters, but there's a few bits and bobs that were a bit silly about that episode, but overall, great premiere. And the other honorable mention I was going to mention was The Search, the two-parter that starts out season 3, that has the big reveal on who the founders of Dominion actually are, as Sisko and crew introduce the Defiant with the cloaking device to search for them. Pretty good stuff. So, we'll now get into my top 10 proper, starting with my number 10, In a Mirror Darkly. Absolutely. Yeah, so this is a really good two-parter that delves, it's a I call it the ultimate fanboy two-parter, and I think it does it in the best way possible, not some of the worst ways that, say, Picard Season 3 did, but it shows us the Tholians, it shows us the Gorn, it's a episode that takes place solely in the Mirror Universe, which is the first time we ever done it. They get rid of that stupid Enterprise theme song, which I joke about automatically makes this the best Enterprise episode. And it's just fun and hammy, and it knows what it's doing, and it does it well. So next is my number 9, getting to those separate titles I was talking about. Homefront and Paradise Lost, from season 4 of Deep Space Nine, that deals with the changelings infiltrating Earth and causing mayhem. Now, when I first saw this episode when I was a teenager, I thought the second part was a massive disappointment, because the first part was setting up for this huge espionage changeling hunt type thing, but then the second part pivots to be about this evil admiral who was actually using this scare in order to gain power and to turn the Federation, in, at least temporarily, into a military-controlled dictatorship. And at first, that as a teenager, that bothered me because it felt like a change in direction. But as I got older and got more sort of politically involved, I realized how freaking brilliant that commentary actually was, especially after 9/11 happened. I heard some someone mentioned that had this episode been released after 9/11, the studio probably would have shut it down because it was too on the nose a commentary of 9/11. Quite ironic then that it came out at like 7 or 8 years before those events occurred, that it speaks so specifically to the scare and the paranoia and the bigotry and prejudice that followed those terrorist attacks, and how people can let their fear of an enemy drive them to give up all of their freedoms and liberties. So quite think it's still amazing commentary on an event that happened 8 years after it was made. So next is my number 8, The Best of Both Worlds. I love this two-parter, not as much as other people, because I know many other people would be, how dare this only be number 8, it should be number 1 or 2, but I've been on the record saying I don't like this episode as much as everyone else did, and I do think that people tend to overrate it, but still love it. I still think the threat of the Borg was very menacing. I think it's easily the best use of the Borg in Next Generation, or, yeah, maybe a little bit better than Iborg, but it's the best, like, suspenseful use, because that was more of a dramatic episode. And the cliffhanger was freaking amazing. I will never deny that. I even mention it as one of the best cliffhangers in Star Trek. And they did what they could with the kind of budget and special effects that they had, i.e. we don't get to see the battle, but we do get some interesting character stories involving Riker and Picard. So, yeah. Actually do love that two-parter. So next we'll get to my number 7, which is Workforce, a two-parter in the middle of season 7 of Star Trek Voyager, one of the rare episodes from season 7 of Voyager I actually like, and I really love this episode. Has it toys with what the Voyager crew would be like if they were not the Voyager crew, because their memories are wiped by these aliens trying to fill their workforce. Something having a labor shortage at first is something I couldn't identify with, but after COVID recently, I definitely can identify with how desperate people get in a labor shortage. And they erase their memories, and Janeway actually has this romance with this guy, which I think was a great character story for her. It was great to have her choose between her new life and what she thought was her life, and what her actual life is, being lonely as a starship captain. It was quite amazing, and I think Chakotay got a lot of play in Harry Kim in this episode, which was rare for season 7. So yeah, quite like this two-parter. So next we'll get into my number 6, which is Improbable Calls and the Die is Cast from season 3 of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. This, of course, is the ultimate Garrick two-parter. I think I do prefer part 1 over part 2, but I'm not judging them separately. I'm judging them together. And part 2 was still good. It just had that cliche of the Defiant crew defying orders and to save their friend Odo, and then when they get back, they face no consequences whatsoever, which is so typical. But the whole Garrick having to torture Odo for information and not wanting to do it and not having fun with it was interesting, but I find the first part a lot more sort of engaging, as that deals with Garrick's. They have the best Garrick quotes in this episode about taking the rod and eat it and stuff like that, and his whole spiel about the boy who cries wolf, which is this classic, and it's just all his, like, the way he's deflecting. This is like the best portrayal of Garrick, and we get the really good combination with Garrick and Odo in this episode, how Odo actually figures out his bullshit and calls him out on it, which is great. So it's just a really suspenseful episode. I absolutely love it. So next, we will get into my number 5, which is Chain of Command, a two-parter that happens in the midst of Season 6 of Star Trek Next Generation. It doesn't introduce the Cardassians that have been introduced and the Wounded, and they appeared in Ensign Row, but it's really what's reinforcing them as a main villain that's getting set up for Deep Space Nine to premiere. In fact, this episode was made after the probably that episode of Deep Space Nine was made, even though it aired before it. And it, features Picard and Worf and Crusher going off on a mission, but then Picard gets captured and has this amazingly dramatic, dark performance of Patrick Stewart. Gives it his all, as torture is actually a very important topic for him, and so he put in so much effort, and it really shows the chemistry he has with David Warner, who R.I.P., and who gives a great performance, and the chemistry between the two of them is just amazing. And then you got the other plot, which is also really good, having to deal with one of the worst captain in Starfleet taking over the Enterprise, and Riker rightfully showing him, telling him off, because making it clear he is the worst captain in Starfleet, because he changes the rotation from a 4 rotation shift to a 5 rotation shift for no fucking reason. And when a senior officer's trying to tell him why to do it, he just ignores them. He's a terrible captain. Sorry, I'm getting off on a rant. But it's a great episode. I love Ronnie Cox in his role, and it's just a great two-parter. Anyway, we will get into my number 4, which is What You Leave Behind from Deep Space Nine. So, this episode kind of breaks my rule, but not really. I'm going to justify it, because it belongs to the larger 10-part arc that ends Deep Space Nine. However, the reason why I think this is permissible and something like, Sacrifice of Angels in Favor of the Bold is not, or something like Azadi Prime and Damage is not, is because it gets back to the title thing, where it was shown as a 2-hour episode, and it has the same title. Even if you split it up, it's still What You Leave Behind, parts 1 and 2. So, that makes it, even though it's part of the 10 arc, it's still clearly its own 2-hour or 2-part episode, so that does make it eligible. But anyway, it is the series finale of Deep Space Nine. Absolutely love it. It ends the Dominion War in a dark, thought-provoking way, rather than the heroes winning the war and defeating the evil Dominion. It's a lot more nuance with that, dealing with the Federation or Section 31, who's allied with Starfleet, and not officially, but really behind the scenes, trying to commit genocide, and Odo calling them out for that, and then the founders committing their own genocide against the Cardassian people when they find out they're going to lose. It's just really true to Deep Space Nine, and it ends the war in a way that is dark, that makes it clear that war is bad, that makes you think, and it would be so untrue if they had the big Starfleet heroes winning the day, and I love how they didn't do that, and they got a lot of rich dynamic interplay. Now, this episode would be higher on my list if it wasn't for that half-hour of Vic Fontaine singing bullshit and all the memory, stupid flashbacks of while they're playing this Vic Fontaine bullshit. That kind of brings the episode down for me. But the rest of it's still great, still amazing. So that's my number 4. So coming in at number 3 is Scorpion, the 2-part episode that ends season 3 of Voyager and starts season 4 of Voyager. I think this was an amazing Voyager 2-parter that introduced Species 8472, which unfortunately was only ever used correctly in this episode and one other episode, Prey, before they were completely ruined in season 5. But the concept of having this superior race that can easily defeat the Borg was very intriguing. I think this episode uses that to its ultimate advantage, but more than that, it features is probably the best example of the Chakotay and Janeway First Officer Captain relationship, how the two of them really do not agree, and in fact they start undermining each other, and the resolution of the 2-parter is them finally realizing that they need to work together even though they have different opinions on what to do, and that's amazing. And the way they accomplish that is just works so well. On top of that, of course, you got to mention the introduction of 709, which was a really good introduction that introduces a very dynamic, important character. So yeah, definitely great two-parter. So next, we'll get to my number 2, which is All Good Things, the series finale of Next Generation, and it's still one of the best series finales of all of television that was done right. That shows Picard traveling back and forth through time, through the pilot episode Encounter Farpoint over to 25 years in the future, and using those different time periods to try to solve this mystery of a anti-time anomaly, who we later learn was just a test created by Q to see if Picard could expand his mind. And that it's really testing if humanity really could grow. And it's done so well, and it's so true to Star Trek. And you get all the different interplays between these time periods. It's just a great way. It's like a classic example of how you should end out your series, because it pays homage and respect to the show that came before it, while touching on the themes that the show was all about, while being a very fascinating character story and an interesting sci-fi plot, as well as everything you would want in Star Trek. So then I will get into my number 1 favorite two-parter of Star Trek, and that is Year of Hell, parts 1 and 2, two-part that aired in season 4 of Voyager. Yeah, so this is a particular favorite of mine. I know not everyone would agree, but this shows Voyager of having to deal with completely being outnumbered and alone, something that the show did not touch on enough. In fact, many people, including Ronald D. Moore, has been quoted as saying that the whole show should have been like this. But it was great to at least get a two-parter, and then, of course, the second part, or even the first part, but the second part delves more deeper into the temporal changes in time and how that's affecting things, and how you have the Madman, who's played brilliantly by Kurtwood Smith. Great actor, does a great job in this role of playing this madman who's trying to fix something that is unfixable, and he's going around wiping out all species from existence, and how Janeway eventually, with her piece of crap Voyager, which is barely being coupled together, gets together their lines. And really, I think that this two-parter could have been like a 5-parter or 6-parter or even a season-long arc, but of course the producers shot that down. But it was, I think it still works amazingly well as a two-parter, and I don't care that so many people complain about how the reset buttons hit at the end of the episode. I really don't care, because you get a glimpse, because these are the actual characters. Even though this is an alternate future that never actually happens, this is our characters, and you still see how they would have behaved. It's like getting a parallel universe story, which I still love, is seeing how they would have behaved if they were thrust in this situation. And you really get a lot of great character moments, particularly when Janeway is forced to say goodbye to Tuvok and tries to convince him why she needs to sacrifice herself for Voyager, who had done so much for them. Like, that brings a tear to my eye every time. Really amazing two-parter. So it is my number 1 favorite two-parter of Star Trek. So that is it for my best and worst 2-part episodes of Star Trek. Thanks so much for watching. Be sure to check out my channel as I cover many more Star Trek videos. Just wrapping up my coverage of the original series, and going to blast through the animated series, and then I am going to cover Next Generation 1 episode at a time. So you can check out my channel for that. I want to thank Kyrie091 for requesting this video, and of course I would like to thank all my Patreon supporters for supporting me on Patreon by giving them a shout out. We have Francisco Chuck Hooks, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky Matty Jester, Joel Lavalles, Alessandro Miguelcio, Norman Buchwald, Stephen Kennedy, Brenton Berg, Allison Fordyce, and Brandon Neal House. Thank you all so very, very much for your support, and if you would like to support me on Patreon, there's a link in the description below. $1 a month will get you access to a series of Patreon only videos that I'm doing where I revisit old reviews that I'd already made I'll be doing Next Generation episode reviews, revisiting my reviews for that. And of course, $10 or more will have you, you can request videos like this one for me to do, and I'll do it. So, thanks so much for watching. Be sure to check out my channel, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.